Chair, we're now live on YouTube.
Thank you very much, Wendy. We'll restart the meeting by way of a roll call, just for the benefit of those watching online. I am getting feedback from one member. Could just members ensure that they're always muted. Wendy, over to you just to do a roll call, please.
Lovely. Thank you very much. So, Chair, I'll start with you.
Present at Blackdown House.
Thank you. Councillor Davey.
Present at Blackdown House.
Thank you. I've received apologies for this afternoon from Councillor Allen. Councillor Arnott.
Present at Blackdown House.
Thank you. Councillor Bailey.
Present at Blackdown House.
Thank you. Councillor Blakey.
Present at Blackdown House.
Thank you. Councillor Chamberlain.
Present online.
Thank you. Councillor Hayward, sorry, apologies.
Present at Blackdown House, thank you.
Sorry. Councillor Howe is still not present, so I'll move on to Councillor Ingham.
Present at Blackdown House.
Thank you. Councillor Moulding has given his apologies for this afternoon, so I'll move on to Councillor Pratt.
Present at Blackdown House. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Ryland.
Present at Blackdown House.
Thank you. And finally, Councillor Skinner.
Present at Blackdown House.
Thank you. I confirm we're quorum for this afternoon's meeting.
Thank you very much, Wendy. So we'll start the afternoon session with agenda item 11, which is housing policy matters. And as per usual, Ed Freeman to present his report.
Thank you, Chair. Excuse me. So this report seeks to explore issues around housing need and wider housing issues, and that thorny subject of housing numbers, which obviously keeps cropping up when it comes to the local plan. So just to talk you through the report, there's a number of sort of technical concepts and things in this report, so I'll try and just briefly cover those to start with. In terms of the examination and the tests that the local plan has to comply with, there's really 4 tests of soundness that the local plan will have to meet in all respects, but obviously housing will be a key area. And these tests relate to the plan having to be positively prepared and justified, effective and consistent with national policy. And in order to do that, there's various housing terms and concepts that get used, such as housing requirement, housing need, and housing supply, which this report tries to address and draw various issues to members' attention. So section 3 of the report sort of talks through the responses to the consultation, the issues and options consultation that we've referred to earlier in this meeting, but you can see there's a number of comments come through that to aid members' consideration of this report, we've divided into those key concepts around housing need and the comments that related to that, housing supply comments, those that relate to the housing requirements, and also brought in factors around the spatial strategy and affordable housing in terms of the comments received in relation to those issues. We obviously need to make sure that the plan is clearly written and ambiguous to meet the requirements of the NPPF. And the housing requirement policy will therefore need to clearly express the total net number of dwellings to be provided, the area to which that figure relates, the time period to which that total relates, and whether the total net number of dwellings is a minimum. We also need to consider issues around possibly breaking that down in terms of the requirement into sub-areas, as we did with the previous local plan. You will recall there was the sub-area around the Growth Point area and the west end of the district. Issues around housing tenure requirements. So how do we want to split that between market housing and affordable housing? And are there specific tenure types that we want to to achieve in relation to that split, and then also potentially net targets around dwelling sizes, which I think comes back to an issue raised in this morning's session about the types of and forms of housing that we want to deliver and ensuring we're meeting the local housing needs that were identified in the Housing Needs Assessment report. The other issue that stems from that is translating issues around what we call a policy off need and a policy on need. So some members who were involved in the previous local plan will recall that we had a sort of baseline figure, the policy off position, and then that figure was increased because of a desire to, or a need that was identified to increase the amount of housing coming forward to reflect the economic strategy in the plan around increasing job numbers, and the promotion of high-tech industries fundamentally in the growth point area, which was then generating an economic growth scenario and greater jobs growth than would usually be the case, which then led to a higher need for housing. So we need to be wary of those sorts of issues as we progress with this local plan and the impact of decisions in other areas of the plan, such as the economic strategy would then potentially have on housing numbers. And as part of that, we need to test a range of alternative scenarios so that we can guide the examination and the inspector ultimately through our thought process. So the government expects meeting housing needs to be central to any local plan, and assessing the housing needs is one of the first steps in the process of deciding how many homes need to be planned for. So the report in section 4 talks about a number of options. Option 1 being the standard method, which we talked a lot about at previous meetings, which gives us a figure from the government standard methodology, which is currently 928 dwellings per year as a minimum. And the government expects it to be treated as a minimum. We've yet to formally decide a plan period for the plan, but it's the issues and options consultation report envisaged an end date of 2040, which would give the plan a 19 or 20-year plan period, leading to a total plan need of about 18,560 dwellings. We should, however, remember that the 928 dwellings per year figure is assessed on an annual basis by the government, so it can't be treated as definitive. It's a slightly moving feast, but it hasn't moved a great deal in recent years. I think it was 980 at one point, 18 rather at one point. It's now 928. And obviously the government have dropped proposals for redesigning the standard methodology, which members will recall gave us a housing need figure of about 1,600 a year, which we clearly objected to, and that message seems to have got through, fortunately. So we're back down to 928. So we'll also need to test the ability to accommodate that figure with evidence to demonstrate whether this level of housing and the related household and population growth result in sufficient workers, the environmental impact of this growth, and the impact and availability of infrastructure to support that level of growth. Option 2 in the report talks about an alternative, which would be potentially looking at a higher figure than the standard method. As I say, that may arise from other decisions through the plan making process about the economic strategy that members want to pursue. And that and a number of other circumstances are mentioned in table 2. So you can see a growth strategy for the area is part of that approach, potentially as an option. Strategic infrastructure improvements may be a driver for increasing the number of homes to be provided at a local level. There's this issue about neighbouring authorities that we touched on earlier, and requests that they may make, which we will need to consider. And there's other circumstances as well, which are not specifically mentioned in the PPG, but not precluded, around strategic objectives that we might have for urban renewal, being mindful of previous assessments of housing need, and issues around meeting affordable housing needs. So, for example, if members wanted to see a significant uplift in the amount of social housing in the district, you may want to increase that housing number in terms of the overall requirement, to mindful that any proportion is going to be affordable, and therefore the more you deliver as a whole, the more affordable and the more social housing you will deliver. But obviously there are impacts of all of those options that need to be considered as well. A further option is obviously pursuing a lower than standard method figure. And some responses to the issues and options consultation challenged the level of need that was being produced by the standard method. It should be clear that the government expects that the standard method is used and that any other method will only be used in exceptional circumstances. We're aware of some circumstances have been used there elsewhere. There's reference made in paragraph 4.32 to Coventry City's circumstances. However, we think those are quite fundamentally different from the circumstances East Devon, and at the present time we don't think there are any robust arguments to support a lower need figure that would stand up to scrutiny. And so seeking to make a case would potentially put the soundness of any plan prepared on that basis, in our opinion, at risk of being found unsound. So moving on to housing supply, this work to provide the evidence about housing supply continues. Members will be aware you get an annual housing monitoring report. So we're currently preparing an assessment of that in terms of what's happened over the last year, so the year to the end of March this year. And obviously that's going to be interesting evidence to inform production of this plan, given what's happened over the last year and understanding what's happened to our housing supply figures and what that might mean for our projections for housing moving forward in terms of numbers that would be delivered over the next 5 years in particular. So we'll be bringing that forward later in the summer. I should say in terms of supply, I don't think it's looking too bad actually. So just scrolling through the report, there's obviously issues addressed here about any unmet needs. So just as we've mentioned about other authorities who might have an unmet need and might become knocking on our door wanting us to take some of their need, we shouldn't preclude the option that we may find that we have some unmet need and want to go knocking on doors in terms of asking others to accommodate that. So that is also an option available to us. Although I think the principle of each authority consuming its own smoke if possible, as discussed when we were talking about the non-strategic statutory plan, is probably the best approach if we can manage that. So just coming to section 6 of the report, paragraph 6.3 raises a number of issues that members may like to debate and these as a focus for discussion. So just to highlight some of those issues, there's this question about whether members wish to pursue an approach that challenges the government standard method and the resulting housing need figure. As I said, I don't think as officers we would recommend that. I think we could potentially tie ourselves in knots trying to unpick the standard method. The government have been very clear in their guidance that it should be used and should be adhered to. So it would be useful to hear members' views on that, and particularly whether or not that is an option that can be disregarded at this stage at least. Obviously further work is needed in terms of whether or not a higher figure would be needed, depending on what emerges in terms of economic strategy, meeting affordable housing needs, etc. This question B is around, are members willing to accept a higher housing need figure, and if so, do members think that's necessary to address things like affordable housing? I know at a previous meeting, excuse me, there was a clear desire to deliver more social housing. Obviously, we'd need to do further work modelling that, but is that something that members would see as an objective that would justify increasing the housing numbers? Do members accept that there's a direct relationship between housing numbers and jobs? I see this as another key area where the housing numbers could be increased if we have a very much jobs growth agenda again. If we're generating jobs growth beyond standard economic growth numbers, then arguably, in order to ensure that the plan is sound, we should be proportionately increasing the housing need figure as well. And then finally, there's a question around obviously acknowledging that this is a very technical area and there's lots of modelling involved and potential jobs forecasts and sustainability appraisal work, etc. Whether members would appreciate any further training or further reports on particular technical aspects of this area. given its technical nature and its importance, no doubt, and controversy in the district as we move forward with local plan work. So hopefully that's a useful summary of the report and the key issues that we see stemming from that as officers for discussion. Happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed Freeman. So just to remind members that realistically we are looking at page 141, which is option 1, or 142, which is option 2. Realistically, I don't think we should bother even entertaining option 3, because it would just be allocating resources to something that will most likely fail, and we want to move and progress this with this local plan. Can I also just remind all members on page 1151, 6.3 A to D, could we possibly answer some of those questions in our responses? Okay, so we'll start with outside of committee and Councillor Marianne Rickson.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to make some general comments, really. I think we face significant problems in East Devon which need to be taken into consideration. This report does mention about the insufficient numbers of truly affordable housing. I believe this is even worse in Cornwall. Next, there is the growth in second homes, which is eroding our housing stock. This should be resisted, if at all possible, as local people are being priced out. And in fact, Sidmouth now, according to an article in the Sidmouth Herald, is the second home capital in East Devon. Holiday lets. This also affects the viability of villages and small towns. An article, and it also, some owners evade council tax. An article in Devon Live, the 5th of June 21, reported that North Devon in the last 15 years has seen greater demand for holiday accommodation. Devon Live, Cornwall, they already have the worst level of empty houses and second homes in the country. So what can we do to prevent this from happening in East Devon? Next, Sidmouth already has the oldest demographics in the district, and this imbalance needs to be addressed urgently. No more pokey retirement flats at inflated prices, please. And of course, because of the age profile, there is a significant turnover of this housing stock in terms of occupancy. Finally, we must insist whenever we build in future on energy efficient housing. 20% of carbon emissions is from our houses, and so retrofitting is not the way to go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Rickson. Just trying to see if there's anyone else from outside of committee wishing to speak. No. So we move inside of committee. Councillor Rylance, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. At the risk of sounding simplistic, surely our housing need numbers should be led by our need for houses. So we should be building the houses that we need at the numbers that we need, not building as many houses as it takes in order to deliver the houses that we really need, which seems to be the general slant of this. Like, if we need more social housing, then we need to build thousands and thousands of different types of houses that people locally don't appear to need at the moment. I mean, it just seems like a pretty bizarre way of proceeding, really. So we're contemplating in some of these options, building far, far more houses than we apparently need in order to get to the social houses that we do need. I mean, this is slightly upside down, surely. I mean, the more houses we build, the more infrastructure we'll need. So if we're also to balance our commitments to the environment and not build over more of the countryside than we absolutely need to, surely we shouldn't be contemplating building twice or even 3 times more houses potentially than we actually need. I mean, so why don't we push back a little bit on the numbers and ask them to verify those against current and existing census data with a little bit of an uplift for incomers, and actually build the type of houses that people need? Because at the moment we're only delivering them on the back of the type of houses that people here can't really afford yet. So it just seems like we're doing it the wrong way around. Can we look at the needs first and proceed on that basis, rather than pandering to developers and telling them they can build all the 5-bedroom houses they want, or as long as they give us a few council houses? I mean, it's just, are we leading the process or not? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Rylance. I think we'll come back to answer a few of those questions. I would say that we did have ORS data come through about our actual housing need, and that's far in excessive. 18,000 currently. I'll let Ed cover the other points in a second. Councillor Arnott, you're up next.
Thank you, Chair, and I'll be brief. So what we, I think, all want is more social housing and or more affordable homes, attainable homes, as I always call them. So we definitely want that. We want to pick up on the point, capture the point that Councillor Skinner made earlier, which is it's sort of about making sure the infrastructure is there or possible first as well. If we're looking at the questions that have been posed to us, 6.3, if it's any help, I mean, I'll just treat them as exam questions. Do members wish to pursue an approach that challenges the government's standard method? Speaking personally, no, because I think, as Ed has said, we could spend the next few years going through court doing that. Are members willing to accept a higher housing need if evidence suggests that this is necessary to address all needs for affordable, including social housing? I find it hard to intellectually accept the premise of that if we want more affordable and more social, that necessarily then leads to us having to have a higher housing need figure. I can't see the logic in that, but I'm happy to stand corrected. But pending that, I would say no to that. Do members accept the direct relationship between housing numbers and jobs growth? Yes, of course. But again, as Councillor Skinner said, prove the jobs are there first. Don't build the homes hoping that the jobs are going to come along. So we shouldn't let that inflate the figures either, I don't think. And then would we appreciate further training? Well, I'm speaking personally, yes. Any information that we can glean, gratefully received. Thank you, Chair. Oh, sorry, Chair. Also, I'm happy to suggest that option 1 is the way to go out of that.
Thank you very much, Councillor Arnott. Councillor Councillor Hayward, you're up next.
Thank you, Chair. Once again, I must take Councillor Arnott to task for actually saying pretty much what I was going to say, and Councillor Reinhart's previously. So yes, I mean, the recommendations are sound. I'm happy to vote on those, second whatever is necessary. Coming back to those questions, yes, I think there must always be a challenge because these centrally sort of tractor stats that are forced down are seemingly done without any reasoning, and so we should challenge. It's our duty to challenge because it impacts directly on the lives of the residents, and we are voted in as members to protect and look after our residents and give them the life that they want and their children and generations to come. Item B, I have issue with that. We at the planning committee have had our fingers burnt many times because it's an inevitable fact that a great many developers, not all, but a great many developers make promises and then do come back, and often it's through no fault of their own. Viability comes into it and they discover things on their development that they didn't anticipate. But what always seems to give is the affordable housing or another Section 106 obligation somewhere else. So I think even considering that at the front end, that we need to allow them more houses because then the trickle down effect will be more affordables, is incorrect. Also on that, there's still this stigma that social housing, and I won't say affordable housing, but social housing is sort of at the bottom. Great many countries, and I alluded to this in Vienna, that they don't treat them as second-class houses. They don't treat them at the bottom of the barrel. They are housing for people, just as people can afford a 5-bedroom house, others need social housing. It shouldn't be, something we squeeze in because we can, or that it is subject to a bit of negotiation. It isn't. It should just be a factor of a caring society that we deliver housing of this type for those that need it, rather than forcing people to take on affordable homes that actually in some cases are not affordable given the level of income in our district. Item C, yes, I think I'm happy with that. But Councillor Arnott's covered it, and as did Councillor Skinner. Prove the jobs first and then work that way rather than doing it in the other method. And finally, yes, of course, as members of the strategic planning, perhaps it's our duty to always welcome further training on the technical aspects. Mr. Freeman and the officers, and probably yourself, Chair, you know far more than we do, and I'd always welcome some extra insight, some extra training to help me as a committee member make better decisions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll just go to Ed Freeman on that point. Ed, I've just got one more question that I would add into this. I'm kind of in two minds between the option 1 and 2, whereas I think it would be sensible for us to work into a buffer, just in case sites were to stall like we are seeing now with allocations in this current local plan, such as the Axminster Master Plan, which has a significant allocation for the whole of the local plan. Do you believe that it would be sensible to us to work in a small buffer just over the standard method, so that we don't fall foul of what's happened in previous councils where we've actually gone under our 5-year land supply due to sites stalling?
Thank you, Chair. So yeah, just if I start off with the issue Councillor Rylance raised, I mean, I think the assumption that in order to deliver more affordable housing, you need more housing in total, obviously works on the assumption of housing developers delivering the majority of affordable housing as a proportion of the overall housing that's being delivered. So if we carry on the current sort of trajectory as it were, whereby the majority of our affordable housing is delivered as a proportion of the market housing developments, so often 25% of a development is affordable housing, and that's effectively funded by the remaining 75% where the developers make their profits, such that they can deliver the 25% affordable units at pretty much cost and transfer them to a housing association or similar. So if you follow that logic through and look back to our housing needs assessment, we have an affordable housing need total across the 20 years potential plan period of about 9,220 homes. So if we deliver that and continue to deliver that as, say, 25% of the market housing, then that equates to, I think it's 461 affordable homes a year we would need to deliver, which is 25% of the total. You'd have to increase our annual supply of housing to 1,844 homes a year to achieve that. So that's the premise by which we work as officers, in that you would need to see an uplift in the total numbers to increase the amount of affordable housing. Of course, that's based on the premise that we continue to deliver affordable housing in the way that we have been up till now, whereby we're largely reliant on the private sector delivering them as a proportion of their developments. If the council were to take a more proactive role in terms of the delivery of affordable housing, we were to get housing associations and registered providers more engaged in delivering sites themselves that are 100% affordable, then obviously that scenario changes quite dramatically. But that's the reason why we're sort of saying, in order to increase the supply of affordable housing beyond those normal levels that we deliver at the moment, then you would need to increase overall supply. It simply wouldn't be viable to go to developers and say, rather than 25% affordable housing you've been delivering up to now, you now need to deliver 50% or 60%, because their developments simply wouldn't be viable and they wouldn't be built, and we wouldn't deliver any of our housing need. Turning to the options, I mean, I should say, in terms of the options that are outlined in the report, I was only seeking through this report to, if members are so minded, to eliminate the option of going for a lower figure than the standard method. I think we need more evidence to come to a view and make recommendations to members in terms of whether or not the standard method would be sufficient, or whether or not we should be increasing beyond the standard method for one or more of the reasons detailed in the report. I suppose I would caution against choosing between, I think it's options 1 and 2 in the report at this stage. It was simply trying to eliminate option 3 so that we can focus our efforts and our resources on those 2 options, really. In terms of the buffer issue that the chairman raises, I think is a valid point that if we only allocate the exact number that we need to deliver, then there is a risk that if sites are not delivered for whatever reason, then we underprovide. And that makes it very difficult to maintain the 5-year housing land supply and to meet the needs of our communities ultimately. I hope through this plan making work we'll have better evidence and detail about the viability and deliverability schemes than we had with the previous local plan, where I think some sites perhaps weren't assessed as much in those aspects as they could have been, such that the hurdles that were going to have to be jumped to deliver those sites weren't fully understood until further down the road, in relation to things like Axminster urban extension as an example. So I hope by having that greater evidence we can minimise the risks of sites not delivering, but I think there would still be some benefits to have some sort of buffer in there to take account of the fact that some sites may not deliver in the timescales that we envisage. But I think that needs to be looked at again as a strategy comes forward, because I think it depends what is the sort of range of sites. How much are we reliant on a small number of large sites to deliver, or are we spreading our need across a high number of smaller sites where perhaps those risks are addressed through that mixture of sites and options that exist within the market, such that those risks are reduced and potentially a buffer needs to be smaller than it might otherwise be. So lots of work still ongoing on all of those issues, but hopefully that helps to respond to the points raised so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Blakey, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Just want to answer the points raised under 6.3 on page 151. I'll be quick. No, I don't see any point. We're going to get ourselves into a fight that we probably can't win. Let's pick battles that we can win, or might. B, yes, if there is evidence, as is suggested, that higher housing numbers are necessary to address all needs, but one point I would want to make there is regarding affordable housing. It's still a phrase that I hate, and frankly, all housing is affordable if you've got the money. The fact is probably every property in the country is affordable to someone, but what we actually need is social housing, not the so-called affordable. And awful lot of the affordable housing is actually not cheap housing. It's just houses that's built cheaply. And for me, where I see it in Cranbrook, for example, it doesn't really work. I just dislike it. So that would be a yes. And as far as C goes, yes, that's obvious. I don't think there's any argument about that. And as far as D is concerned, I'm going to have a different answer to the others, which is that I would say no. In that instance, I think that it being a highly technical matter, it's something for the officers to appraise and to advise us as councillors. I think that getting into too much of the nitty-gritty of how it's all worked out is probably some. Well, it may just be that it's beyond my little brain, but it isn't something that I would necessarily go with. And actually, finally, if I may, just come back to a comment that Councillor Rickson made regarding empty second homes. That is the scourge of the Southwest, as we know. And I think that one thing that could and should be done, it's not for us to do it, but could and should be done, is a reform of council tax to make sure those people who do have second homes make a substantial contribution towards local infrastructure costs through council tax, and not simply using it as a vehicle to avoid it. And worse still, by way of running them as businesses, claiming reliefs and so on. It's something that really ought to be brought to an end. In my lifetime, I kind of doubt it. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Blakey. Councillor Ian, we're over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, can I say, I totally understand what Councillor Rylance was saying. She's absolutely right. I've always looked in disbelief that we can call it strategic planning when we say, well, we want 100 houses like that, so we'll build 500. And then you say, well, you could have put another 400 there of the ones you wanted, but you've got the wrong ones there. So now you've got to build another 1,000 to get another 400 that you wanted 10 years ago. So that kind of logic, well, I won't tell you what kind of logic I call that, but it's not very good. And I think we ought to change rapidly in our attitude. And one of the things that justifies that is climate change, because we have to be ever so careful how we build houses over the next few years. We want to make, can I say it simply, we want to make everyone a good one, everyone to meet the needs of our requirements. So social housing, yes. Affordable housing, yes. Those live-work units that we were saying, wouldn't it be great if you said, yeah, you can build 100 houses next to Axminster, but every one has to be a live-work unit? I think the interest may drop off and you may get a more reasonable response of only 50 being built. And that's exactly what we need to make, as Councillor Hayward was saying earlier, to make our towns sustainable so that we're not commuting and travelling as much as we are now. That all has to stop. We have to rein back. So I think we have to think the unthinkable, or be prepared to consider it from today moving forwards. For example, we've seen our national government the last 15 months doing the unthinkable in order to attempt to control a pandemic. And I think we've got, in order to address the climate change strategy we've got, then we have to do similar sort of thinking and say, how is it possible that we could control this? How is it possible that our communities could make the money out of this instead of speculators who live in Russia, I don't know, Yorkshire, America, China? We need to make the money out of this so that we can sustainably control our own assets. And so maybe we have to have a new relationship with organisations like Homes England, where we say, we want to buy that. We want to control that. We want to develop that so that we meet the aspirations by 2040 of East Devon. And that we were worried earlier about putting all our eggs in one basket at the West End, and that's completely right. But what we can do is to say, where we do something strategically big in our terms, that we control it meticulously. Yes, you can have extra development where you want it, say at Axminster, Exmouth, or Honiton, or wherever, on a controlled, sustainable manner. But the big deal, our big commitment to housing supply and to growth, is controlled meticulously and isn't left to the speculator to provide it when they want to, if they can be bothered, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Councillor Ingham. I think it comes down to the delivery model, really. I think in the district we've heavily relied on a commercially led development model, and we have laid the foundations of moving out of that and moving into something different. Hopefully setting the foundations for this next plan period, that we could see something different, and that's the foundations that we want to lay now. Councillor Jespe.
Thank you. So answering the questions, I suppose reluctantly I would have to probably accept the government's standard method, although if we can challenge it without actually holding everything else up, that would be quite good. The second thing is, no, I don't want to accept a higher housing figure, because that is basically just making us a hostage to fortune, and I just don't accept that as an acceptable model, that we just have to allow more houses to get the actual ones that we need and want. And I would prefer the proactive model outlined by Ed Freeman earlier. 3, I don't really accept the relationship between jobs and housing numbers mean that if we have growth, jobs growth, then we'll have more houses, because I know what will happen. We'll end up with more houses and not more jobs. And D, yes, unlike Councillor Blakey, I would like some more training on that. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Bailey. Councillor Skinner, you're the last speaker.
Last but not least, no. Councillor Blakey is, and the comments he put forward just overall is no, yes, no. I'm going to agree with all of those points, and I think he actually clarified his position extremely well. I think there needs to be an understanding here that as a planning authority, our role in what we do is really try to detect and try to provide the types of housing for the right types of people and all the rest of it. The reason I say challenging the approach put forward by central government is because they are led by the statistics, and the national statistical office bring the figures forward, and they worked on those figures and they come forward. And I can remember, and I'm sure the other members in this will remember, when we had a young lady in a fresh face as a part of the independent party came challenging the SLAR process for a long period of time. And I'll tell you what that managed to do. It managed to put our local plan on hold, and it managed for developments to take place, but we as an authority didn't want to see them take place because we lost our 5-year housing plan supply. And I've always vowed that I will never ever want to be in a position where we as a local authority lose the ability to put housing where we want to see them to happen. So would I challenge the numbers? Because it may, I'm a Councillor Hayward actually did put, sorry, somebody did a suggestion that let's challenge the numbers if it isn't going to affect us the slow up of the local plan. We're not going to have both. We have one or the other, and so for on that basis, I would accept the figures. But I would accept the figures on this basis. I accept the figures on having the ability to then be able to say to central government, if this is the figures we're going to do, we work within our local plan, back to the planning inspector, but we very much working on the infrastructure that's required to develop the housing numbers which they've given us, because they can't either have it all one way and not the other. They have to provide the sorts of infrastructure that's going to be required. And as somebody mentioned earlier, and I forgot who was suggesting it, I think it's Councillor Blakey again, taking the words right over his mouth, and I did agree with him, saying it's not about having affordable housing in this 2-tier category of housing. I really dislike 2-tier category housing. I like to think all housing that is built is affordable, and he made a very good point. The problem is what is deemed as the affordable housing is actually housing that's just built cheaper, and you end up in that scenario to try to get levels right. The conversation that we have in the central government is how we control land prices, because it's the land prices that drive the price up to such a high level. Then they work on their business models. The developers, right, they're trying to get the land, they do the option agreements, they do it, and we as authorities and planning are always on the back foot in the whole of this process. And that's why I think that the whole process in some ways fails on many fronts. And what Ed and the team have to do is trying to drill down through and get to a place whereby we have the two things. We've got to have the housing, but we want protectionism. So you will want one whole thing. But what we are as a local authority is we put the planning out there, and then it all gets left. And there's a scenario that we could think about doing when we talk about how we're going to get delivery of housing numbers, because we have to ensure from Ed's perspective, he's wanting to make sure we get a housing delivery numbers, so then we don't get lost in our 5-year housing plan supply. And that is that one of the things that we do is a developer comes along and they have a piece of land, and let's just say, just for argument's sake, I'll just take a scenario. Somebody take 100 acres of land, and then we happen to put a planner in it, we say yes to some forms. The developer goes off, they get the planning, and off they do it and go. Well, that developer might not actually have all the ability to develop that land out for that 100 acres to deliver, say, I don't know, let's just take 1,000 houses for argument's sake. And what I would like to see in some way, and the question I might be a little bit to Ed is, and I know some people do it, but how we do get the numbers to be delivered out is that smaller developers get an opportunity to actually deliver something, say, 20, 50 houses. There are some developers that actually work at different levels. There's your one-man banders that build the odd house or two in the village and the small towns and those sort of developers. And then you've got the developer that could do up to sort of 20, 25, maybe up to 50 houses. Even they're quite big, but 20, 25, which is still your smaller local builder doing that type of thing. And then there's your large players that play on perhaps up to say 500 houses, and then you've got the others that got thousands all over the country. And it's getting that balance between those people to get those housing numbers delivered out. The more you have the smaller developers delivering those houses out and giving what I would like to see is, so if you could take, I was born in Exmouth, so I'll refer to Exmouth. If you take Exmouth as a town, there's Marple, Brixton, Widdicombe, Littleham, all of these different areas, all of us towns have all got these places where they are. They were all actually villages that have amalgamated into one place. So when we're actually building something as a town, we need to identify the type of housing that we want. But they don't have to all be the same type of thing just because there's 5,000 houses that go there, so they just work on the scheme. They can break them up so the architecture works, the type of development works for the type of people that are coming forward to build, to live in those type of houses and the affordability of them. There's a lot of work here to be done on understanding where we're going and how we're going to go forward. And for me, to challenge the numbers would be a no-no for me. I just wouldn't be challenging the numbers. Do we find having an acceptability of higher housing numbers if indeed the opportunity comes? We spoke earlier about many members were in agreement with the position I was taking on how we need to be more flexible in our approach. And I think all Ed is saying is it's not necessarily just numbers, but if we have within the plan the flexibility to have those numbers, if indeed we wanted that to happen and to be in that place, why would we shut ourselves down from the position of having that flexibility? And it doesn't open the floodgates, and I take Councillor Bailey was saying that all it does is it sort of I don't believe that. I believe we are controlling that. I think that's a little bit of scaremongering position. But we do need to understand is that many of the people that we respond to these sorts of consultations that we do. I almost take the position where I think actually when we put a consultation for housing, everybody who lives in a house should be able to be part of the consultation because they've already got an interest, because they've already got a house. If you understand the argument to that, I know that doesn't work that way, but if you can understand the argument to that, the people we don't really hear from the loud voice it's the people who really need the houses. What we do hear from all sorts of people that I don't like where you do development, it's not behind my house, and there's a lot of pressure for that. So strategic planning isn't about individual applications. Strategic planning is about how we strategically planning for the future with the infrastructure and all of those other things that go with school, education, housing. So when I set out how the challenges for this committee and what I believe Ed is looking for in guidance of one of the drop-out option 3, I'm not sure if anybody else is going to suggest that, but I'm certainly not going to suggest that. I do like the way that they're going forward. I am going to be agreeing with, in answer to 6.3, in what Councillor Blakey said, no to A, yes to B, yes to C, and no to D. And I will fully support that the officers are the qualified people. And I'm not against the fact that anybody wants to learn anything new. Really not against that. I'm up for that. But at the same time, I do think that there are qualified people that do a qualified job, and we respect their opinions. And if somebody wanted to know something, we can ask these people. If there's certainly a question, if anybody dives into something and wants to know more. And I do know that when you're on the front line as chairman and vice chairman of these committees, you get involved in more of that detail, and you get to learn so much more about that, and quite rightly so, because you're leading the process along with the officers, and you take the guidance from what's going forward. So for me, I'm going to be my views are that what we trying to get from here is to give Ed and his team ability to steer, and I believe in the leadership of these district councils at the moment is that they weren't not looking for hold-ups to this local plan process. I believe that's something what I've been hearing, and on that basis, I think the things that I've said are just things for discussion and going forward that we can get but at the same time, certainly not to be putting anything in place that's going to hinder the local plan process, because my biggest fear, and you all may already know, but we already have a planning application now that has just gone to the planning inspectorate, and within that process is challenging our 5-year housing landscape. I have to think we'll, and I'm sure Ed could give some, I have to think we'll win it, actually, because I don't think we have got that issue, but it's already started, that process has started, and that's, I can tell any of you, and I'm sure any members who weren't here when we lost our 5-year housing land supply, it was a terrible, terrible place to be in. It really is. It's really bad. But there we go. I've said my say. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
So next up is Councillor Davey.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, on question A, like other members, I don't see any point in picking a fight with the government on this one. Yeah, thank goodness they backed down on a much higher figure, and perhaps we'll just let sleeping dogs lie there. I did ask Ed how these figures were arrived at recently, and he said it was a dark art. And I think that pretty much sums it up, and I think his opinion was best leave it alone. Are we willing to accept a higher need figure? I'm not sure our residents are going to support a big increase in housing just in order to deliver affordable and social housing, and I think we need to find more innovative ways of doing that through community land trusts, self-build, small builders. Ed has said we can't really go down the route of requiring a bigger proportion of affordable housing, and it's already been pointed out, affordable is not always affordable for local people. I'm constantly astonished at the ratio between earnings and house prices in the area, and I don't know how anybody manages to buy a house. When I moved to Exmouth in 1983, I could buy a house for roughly 3 times my salary, which was quite a modest salary. And now it's more like 10 times average salary. So I don't know how anybody does it at all. So I need to I think we need to find other ways of delivering that affordable and social housing, whether it's doing it ourselves or finding other models. As far as jobs growth is concerned, I think it totally depends where the houses are. There's no point in saying, well, we've got a strategy here, it's promoting jobs growth, so we'll have lots more houses if those houses aren't going to be where the jobs are. And we've got a problem with this, that houses are bought as second homes or they're bought by retired people, and there's not that particular link with jobs. So I think we need to be very careful about that and make sure that the link between the jobs and the housing was very, very firm. And going back to Councillor Rickson's question earlier, I wanted to ask Ed if we can insist on higher insulation standards in houses that are built, and perhaps how they're heated as well, because developers are still putting in gas boilers, which are going to have to be ripped out at some point, probably before the end of their lifetime. So I'd like to know just how much we can insist on with those. As far as further training is concerned, I'm not sure I particularly want training on the technical aspects, but I'm always happy to have more training.
Thanks very much, Councillor Davey. We'll go to Councillor Ingham. I believe what's put forward about
Yeah. Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to propose the recommendations as printed, because we have to start somewhere, and this is early days. We can't plan to the nth degree right now. We come up with all the wrong answers, but we have to ask our officers to start somewhere. But Chairman, in saying that, I think not only do we need strategic plans, we also have to provide new attitudes and ways of thinking on how we're going to move these forwards. We really have to shape up if we're going to control what happens in this district over the next 20 years. And it's up to us to guide the officers and say, look, we can't just be passive. We have to start taking control of our own destiny. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Ingham. Councillor Blakey, I believe that's coming in second.
It is, Chair. Yes, the recommendations as written, I think make sense for this stage. So yes, happy to second Councillor Ingham's proposal.
Thank you very much. Mr. Shaw, can we take that to a vote, please? Sorry, Councillor Arnott, you just want to quickly come in.
Just a clarification, I would have happily seconded that as well.
Mic down.
Captain Scar, anybody remember that? Showing her. There we go, Ben gets it. Totally agree with what Councillor Ingham and Councillor Blakey just said. Just trying to understand, Chair, does Mr. Freeman, though, need some steers from us on 6.3? Because there were various points of view, weren't there? Some people wanted training, some people didn't. Are we happy just to let that kind of carry over? That's just a question on the statement.
Ed, I'll just put it to you here. Do you think you've got a flavour of the debate that you can take back to the planning policy team of what's been said? Obviously, I know that Wendy would be frantically writing it all down as in the minutes.
Certainly, from my point of view, I think under 6.3, it might be useful to have a resolution on that, because that's really going to dictate the direction of travel in terms of some of the work we're doing moving forward. So having that more firmly bottomed out would be useful. I took the general consensus to be, in terms of B and C, that members were open-minded about the housing figure overall being varied in relation to affordable housing and jobs growth, but us needing to present evidence to support any changes in those regards. In terms of point D into training, my understanding was the majority didn't want further training, but it would be useful if there's others that do. Obviously, we can do a session if there's enough members who are interested in having that. So if there's more than a couple who want that, we can always do a small session with a small number if there's enough to make that worthwhile.
Ed, with regards to the training, do you think we could just send an email round to members and they come forward with who wishes to go on it and who doesn't? I think that's the easiest way on that point. With regards to 6.3a, the proposer and the second are just happy to add into that we won't be challenging the government's standard method. So it just discounts to option 3. You happy with that, Councillor? You're on mute.
Sorry, Chair, I certainly go along with that if we finish it with something at this time, because you never know what's around the corner and what horrendous model they may come up with next. But as we are now, it would be wrong for us to work otherwise.
Thank you very much, Councillor Ingham. Councillor Blakey is second. Are you happy to do that?
Happy with that, yes.
Chair, I'm sorry to be awkward. I might have to amend slightly. I'm still not sure on B and C. Personally, my answers to B and C are both no's, and to D is yes, but you've covered D because an email. I'm not sure if that's what Ed is picking up. Can we ask Ed again, what are you thinking we're thinking, Ed, about B and C? Are you thinking we're kind of agnostic about it, or are you thinking we're very much in favour of accepting higher housing need numbers on both of those?
He stated in his reply that we're open-minded about B, and then with regards to C, it's along the same lines, if I'm not correct, Ed.
But all I would suggest to that is that that's not what it says here, is it? That those two statements aren't open-minded; they're members are willing, and we are accepting. And perhaps I'm being pedantic there, Chair, but I don't know if anybody else. Perhaps it's just me.
No, with regards, if we relate it to the actual recommendations, we've given our opinion. It's just moving it along and then trying to back up everything with evidence. It will all come back. Councillor Bailey.
Should we not have a vote on what we think on B and C, so we're expressing a clear view?
We could add to the recommendations, but the recommendations don't contain B and C.
I know, but if I'm not sure that the flavour is really coming out, because I think the majority of people don't want to accept a higher. Well, that's the sense that I'm getting. Well, let's have a vote then.
I think it was the case of what Ed was saying earlier, is we don't want to make the decisions right now between options 1 and 2, and that we should let the evidence dictate what comes forward. So we shouldn't shut the door on it straight away without having a fully briefed with the evidence of it. And that's why we have the recommendations before us set out the way that they do, because we want to.
But we've just all gone through and discussed at length A, B, C, and D. So even if we don't have a vote, I think there needs to be a sense of what the room feels about those options, even if it's not a formal vote, because Councillor Skinner is saying that he doesn't agree with my perception is that the majority of people in this room are not willing to accept a higher figure at this particular point in time, and there generally isn't a appetite for recognising the link between justifying higher housing based on jobs and growth. So that's the sense that I'm getting.
Ed, if I bring you in at this point.
Thank you, Chair. Well, just to back up what you were saying, Chair, I had purposely not put forward a recommendation specifically about those two issues, because I'm mindful that we've not presented you with detailed evidence of the arguments for and against those. The questions were posed to sound out members in terms of their current feelings on those issues, and I hear what members have said, and there's been a mix of responses would be how I would summarise things. A number of members have said they would not be willing on either count. I would say an equal number have said that they are perhaps agnostic and open-minded to that. So that's as much as I was looking for at this point in time, mindful that I would bring further reports in due course with further evidence and firm recommendations of whether or not we think as officers it would be appropriate to vary the housing figures in relation to delivering affordable housing or jobs growth. It may be that it's not necessary in our minds as officers, and the evidence doesn't support that. So from my perspective, I don't feel there's a need for a formal resolution on those points at this time, but it was useful to hear members' thoughts at this point in time. Thank you.
Sorry, so with that, we've had a proposer and a seconder. Mrs. Shaw, can you take us to a vote, please, on that?
Thank you, Chair. I hate to reopen it. However, Ed did ask for the government standard methodology for calculation to be part of the resolution. So I have added that into the third element of the motion. If that is still to go forward, I believe that's what you asked the proposer and seconder. So therefore, members, you have before you that Strategic Planning Committee endorse in principle the need for robust evidence on housing need and supply to justify strategic policy on housing requirement provision to include in the local plan. That Strategic Planning Committee endorses the transparent and timely use of that evidence through the plan making process to justify local plan policy on housing requirement provision. And lastly, that Strategic Planning Committee consider and comment on the questions raised in paragraph 6.3 of the report and consider they won't challenge government standard methodology at this time to help to inform officers' work in developing a housing strategy for the new local plan. Members, those of you in the chamber, please press your green tick if you're in support of the motion, press your red cross if you're against the motion, or raise your electronic hand to indicate you're abstaining from the vote.
And for those watching online, the vote is now taking place. I'm just waiting for one more councillor to enter either way. So, Chair, I have for you 5 votes for, no votes against, and 3 abstentions. So that is carried, Chair.
Thank you very much, Debbie, and thank you very much, Mr. Shaw. Moving on to agenda item 12, strategy for distribution of development and an initial overview. And again, over to Ed Freeman to present a report.
Thank you, Chair. So, as you say, this is a sort of introduction to this issue of developing a distribution strategy and settlement hierarchy. So there'll be further reports on these issues. But just to kind of set some of the background to this, the National Planning Policy Framework expects strategic policies in any local plan to set out an overall strategy for the pattern, scale and quality of development. Significant development should be focused on locations which are or can be made sustainable through limiting the need to travel and offering a genuine choice of transport modes. We've obviously touched on this a number of times through the meeting already in terms of issues of sustainability, transport issues and sort of self-containment of settlements. And so these are key factors moving forward in terms of developing a strategy for growth and the settlement hierarchy, which will potentially look to sort of arrange a hierarchy around issues about sustainability. So members will be aware that the current adopted local plan sets out a spatial strategy for the distribution of development through strategies 1 and 2. Those policies refer to the total amount of housing and employment land needed to be delivered, the overall spatial strategy and the numbers to be delivered at the West End and each town and across the villages and rural areas. Members will recall that the strategy we had in the current local plan has very much a West End focused approach to new housing development. And that's one of the options that was consulted on within the issues and options consultation, with 31% of responses favouring that approach. This is closely followed by continuing the current pattern of development, 27%, and a smaller proportion of people, 16%, supported less focused growth in the West End and more homes at towns and villages elsewhere in the district. So we're currently working on a study on the role and function of settlements, which will contain evidence to inform the settlement hierarchy. And the factors that we're considering that are things like population and age profile, numbers of jobs and balance of jobs to workers, number of non-domestic rated properties, so number of business premises fundamentally, commuting patterns, and different community facilities such as a train and bus links, schools, shops, healthcare, etc. And as I said earlier, now obviously taking into account digital communication and broadband speeds in those locations as well. So that report should be available for your next meeting in July. And then off the back of that, we'll obviously be looking at the distribution of development to be attributed to each of these settlements. And logically, that needs to follow the settlement hierarchy. So that report is obviously going to be quite a key paper in terms of taking forward the strategy for growth and the local plan development. We also need to consider in identifying the amounts of housing and employment development in each of those settlements issues like the district-wide requirements, as we've been talking about in terms of housing, environmental constraints, as we know, very constrained district in those respects. We also need to look at the sustainability appraisal in terms of assessing the impacts of different options and different scenarios in relation to that, land availability, the infrastructure requirements in those locations and issues of viability, which we've also touched on in the previous report in relation to delivery of affordable housing. So really this report's just to introduce those sorts of issues and update members on where we are with that, as a more substantive report will be coming to your next meeting in terms of the settlement hierarchy. But hopefully this is a useful update and, as I say, highlights the various issues that we'll be taking forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ed Freeman. Does anyone from outside of committee wish to speak on this item? No. So we'll move it into committee, and Councillor Rylance, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. As ever, given where I live, I'm going to go on at length really about the West End of East Devon. The West End of East Devon is a collection of villages. It's not a desert. And we are faced with a rather bizarre situation where fields between villages are in tier 1, whereas the actual villages themselves are possibly in tier 3 or even lower if their broadband provision isn't up to speed. I'm incredibly uncomfortable that we're now adding broadband into the mix of what makes a village sustainable or unsustainable. My hamlet went from broadband of 1 megabit per second to 20 megabits per second in the space of a few weeks. Are we really going to base our strategic planning policy on something that can be very, very easily remedied with a little bit of thought? Are we really going to tell a village that has poor broadband that it can't build? Because that could be sorted out incredibly easily. We're already consigning some of our communities to almost certain death because they don't have one of the elements that makes them arbitrarily sustainable as a settlement. And the end result of that is that fewer and fewer houses are built. The houses that are there are increasingly expensive and increasingly bought by people who are not likely to have children. And then the school goes, and then the shop goes. And then before long, when you've got a hamlet, it's no longer a village, it's a hamlet. In order to keep our rural communities sustainable, we need to make sure that young people can stay living there. If we're now going to categorize villages by whether or not they have decent broadband, a thing that could be sorted out in the space of a few weeks with enough thought and resources put into it, this just makes me incredibly uncomfortable. Furthermore, I mean, there are places in the middle of Dartmoor that have better broadband than some places in the middle of East Devon. Are we saying that they should have new towns in the middle of Dartmoor because they've got better broadband? I mean, it's just slightly nonsensical that something that's actually not geography dependent should be taken into the mix. And you know, I totally understand why you think broadband is important. I think broadband is important, but it's one of the easiest things to sort out. So should it really be a planning consideration as to whether we allow a settlement to go ahead with more houses? I mean, I don't think so personally, because it's so easily sorted. Yeah, so harking back to page 94, where you set out your tiers, Ed, you've put Pinho in that. Pinho is an extra city council, so I don't really know what it's doing in here. We don't have any control over Pinho. I think the place you mean is Westclist, which is still part of Broadclist. And not likely to change. Just because Blore Home says it's Pinho doesn't mean to say it is Pinho, sorry, but it's not. We keep having to have fights with Exeter City Council over that. So, with that in mind, do we really want to be telling villages they can't develop because they have poor broadband at the moment? Or do we want to try and actually create the framework where settlements have better broadband? It can be very easily done. I don't think we should lay it down in a long-term plan. We do need to be allowing villages to develop houses for young people if we want those villages not to become moribund. So, you know, why add even more complications, especially on something that's so easily sorted out? Sorry, that's my omni-gripe really. The West End of East Devon is a collection of places, it's a collection of villages, it's Clyst St Mary, it's Clyst Honiton, it's Broadclist, it's Rockbere. It's not a desert at the moment, it is places. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Rylance. Councillor Skinner, try and follow that up.
I think. It must be some. How's that? It's not on mute now. Hey? Can you hear me?
Unfortunately, Councillor Skinner, we do have an unfortunate echo now. I don't know whether Strata are available to assist.
What, you got me double?
No, just your speech is echoing. Unless somebody else can. No, I was going to suggest somebody else lend you their headset.
Can I take my headset off?
It's not COVID secure though.
I didn't unpack it, Shirley.
Thank you.
I'll sign a waiver, Shirley.
How's that? Yes, yes.
Who? It's up then. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, it's that thing there then. That's good. Oh, I think it is. Oh, yeah, what was I talking about? I was responding. Right. Yes, I will. All right. I've got it. Yes. Council of violence. Yes. Yes, I think, to get some balance, I think having the, I find it quite ironic, really, that the members here bang on and on and on about how awful broadband is, and Council of violence in a sentence says that broadband's quite easy to rectify. I do know what she means, and I do, Council of violence, I do respect what you're saying, and I do know what you mean by that. It's not quite as easy, but the thread, I believe, of where she's coming to and trying to understand is saying we can't set the principles of planning on the back of because you can get some broadband. But at the same time, for Mr. Freeman, I don't think that's either what he means either. He's not predicating that planning is going to be back on the backdrop of whether or not you've got broadband or not. It was just another aspect that what he thought, I believe he thought, and please, Ed, if I've got it wrong, was another aspect to the important social living of which we have in homes, particularly in the villages, that we could put that somewhere into so that we understand the importance of broadband. And I think Council of Violence as well absolutely wants to get across the view that the importance of broadband for home working and for those other such things. So I think that is really important. And I don't take anything from both points of view. From what Council of Violence is saying is wrong, but at the same time, Mr. Freeman isn't wrong either. So I think we're all in the same place. It was just the understanding of it. As far as the rural areas are concerned, I do very much agree with Council of Violence regarding if we don't allow some development in the villages of which we live, they do the terminology we used to use years ago, and I'm sure Mr. Councillor Ingham would know, we used to call it withering on the vine, and the villages would wither on the vine. And it's very difficult to understand what that balance is as we're going forward. But there are many villages, and the villages that I represent would all like to see a little bit of housing. What they don't want to see is 50 houses turn up to many of the small villages, because that would be such a big impact to many of them. It changes the diversity of them and the heart and soul as to what those villages are. So I think what we might term as organic growth in a small way, and also having, and Councillor Rhines makes a very good point regarding young families coming, that keeps some of the schools going. The village of which I live in, Tallerton, doesn't have a school. But the other three villages, Payhambury, Broadhenbury and Plymtree, all have a school. Now, if we don't have young people in those villages that goes to those schools, the schools will close. It's not rocket science. None of this is rocket science, but it's how we get the balance. And then, of course, what we need is that the type of people that are going to have young families, and that be within the villages, the type of housing can't be either 5, 6 bedroom houses, of which the likelihood is that they're not going to have the young families in the big houses. That doesn't mean to say there's a blanket cover for everybody with everything, but that's certainly what that is. So from my aspect, I very much support many things that Council of Violence was saying, because I think our understanding was trying to bang the drum for the rural areas and understand we've got many diverse small villages within the environment of which we operate, and they're not all big, the big Pinot, as you want to call it, West Clist, or whatever you want to call it, Broadclist, Cranbrooks, and the like. There are many developments as we go forward. So from my aspect, I fully understand where you are with this, but I do sometimes, and I think I would like to understand more, and perhaps I listen to some others, because I'm trying to understand almost like a checklist of how you get development in a village. And if that becomes systemically increasingly more difficult, then I don't think that's something I want to support. And again, we talk about flexibility. within the village type scenario and listening very much. And I think there was a member was very much talking that the weight of those neighbourhood plans are to this process. And I very much like to see that if that is the process going through, and I've got Talenton where I live and represent, and they haven't got a neighbourhood plan, and they don't seem to have got anybody to do one, and neither is Alderscombe. There's a lot of work put into that. So, pardon? Oh, is it? So I think as far as Councillor Rylance is concerned, much of what she said I agree with. She didn't quite balance it quite out, but I do agree with Ed as well. We need to understand what we mean by broadband, but the neighbourhood plans as well, working with the villages, is absolutely vital to how we go forward in our plan process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Skinner. Councillor Hayward, you're up next.
Do you need this?
That's fine, Chair. I think Councillor Skinner's said enough for all of us. Not in a bad way, but there's nothing really more I can add. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Davey, over to you.
I think a lot about this idea of sustainability, and I think our current criteria, because I come across them in planning like other members of this committee all the time, it's a bit of a blunt instrument, and sometimes I'm forced to reflect that Exmouth as a whole within the built up area boundary is considered a sustainable place because it has excellent communications, it's got a town centre, it's got schools, and yet there's a huge amount of traffic going in and out of Exmouth, and there are parts of Exmouth that are further from the town centre or from schools, or from the school of their choice anyway, than some villages are from their nearest village. So I think we need to be a little more subtle about the way we treat sustainability when we're looking at the location of development, and consider more carefully whether there is availability of buses. And I very much hope that the government's recent proposals to bus back better, as they're putting it, do come to fruition, because I think that it would make a huge difference to rural areas like this to have better bus services. But I think we need to be a little bit more subtle about this. We recently had an application in a village which on paper it was classed as not sustainable, but actually it had a convenience shop relatively close to it, within walking distance. It was right on the cycle route to Exeter or Exmouth, or to the next village, and yet it was considered an unsustainable location. So I would like to see us, when we come to draft the local plan, looking much more acutely at how we class sustainability, and get a little bit more subtle about that.
Thank you very much. Ed, as part of obviously the new local plan process, do you think you could bring us a paper on the villages plan? Obviously, that's already a plan that's been made, but could we bring back something, a briefing note to help the committee better understand the sustainability amongst villages in East Devon and how we actually categorise that? Is that possible?
It's more than possible. It's in train, yes. So, I mean, effectively, that's part of the report that will be coming to the July meeting on the settlement hierarchy. So it's looking again at what was done with the villages plan, the criteria that was used to then look at whether or not settlements were sustainable, and going through that again in light of what we now know and what's changed since then. So yes, that's part of the report that will be coming to the July meeting. And just to clarify, my point about broadband speed was simply that should now be one of the criteria, not that it should trump any of the others. Clearly, we still need to look at whether or not there's primary school, a village shop, bus routes, etc. But it's an additional criteria that we didn't have previously. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Freeman. I think Councillor Ingham's going to come in with a recommendation now.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm a bit concerned because I'd like to propose the recommendations with a bit of a change. I think recommendation 2 seems straightforward, but the wording of recommendation 1, at this stage, surely it's better for us to just note the various issues and options rather than to consider, because you're then going to be asking us to make a direct proposal, which I don't think is helpful at the moment. Should it not be both of them to note, you know, the various issues, and also in the second one to note the intention for the further report? What's Mr. Freeman's opinion on that, please, Chair, as a proposal?
Ed, what are your thoughts?
Yep, certainly happy for members to just note the various issues and options. As you say, you probably need further information and evidence from us to fully consider the issues and options anyway. So quite, it's a good point. I think a note is probably more appropriate than consider.
I'm happy to second Councillor Ingham there, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Arnott seconding. Councillor Bailey, and then we'll sum up.
Thank you. One of the things that I would like to be considered, and I'm sorry if I've missed it, but is the amount of development that's already taken place in recent years in some of our communities. There has been substantial development, and I think almost to start from a kind of blank sheet of paper, I think that there should be a consideration when looking at the distribution of development as to where the development has been over the past 5 years, because some of our communities have experienced vast levels of development and some not so much. So I'd just be interested for some input from Ed Freeman on that, and whether that can be taken into account when looking at future distribution. Thank you.
Ed, do you think you could just cover off that last point, and then we'll go to Mrs. Shaw?
I mean, it's something we can look at. I mean, it's difficult when we're trying to focus growth in sustainable locations. That, you know, the locations that didn't take growth last time probably didn't because they weren't considered to be sustainable locations. And so unless they've now become sustainable locations for some reason, I don't think we could necessarily distribute growth to them simply because they didn't take growth in the previous plan period. We need to follow the sort of planning logic of where growth is going, and that may mean that some growth has to go in locations that have already experienced significant growth in the last plan period. But I appreciate that can be difficult for communities to accept, and obviously in some cases we may be at a scale of growth that in itself is unsustainable. So that's also something we need to be mindful of if we're piling growth upon growth and not delivering the infrastructure to support that growth. Then further growth in those locations may not be sustainable. So I suppose in summary what I'm saying is it comes back to sustainability fundamentally, and so we'll have to follow that through with the evidence that comes forward to the local plan.
Councillor Ingham, you seem like you want to come back on that point.
Yes, he's very naughty. He didn't address Councillor Bailey's question, in my opinion, because back along, Chairman, years and years ago, it was the officers who said all of the identified sustainable developments have to have a target number of houses, you know, and you can use your neighbourhood plans to hit those numbers and achieve them. So I think I'm hoping Councillor Bailey would be interested to say, well, what were those targets 8 years ago, and which settlements hit them and which totally ignored them? I think that's what a question was really alluding to, and it would be interesting to see who bothered to address it and who didn't, Chair. Not part of this proposal, but at some stage we should review that.
And I don't want to throw that onto Ed Freeman right now, because I think you'd just be plucking figures out of the sky. I don't think you could have all those numbers in your head at the moment, could you, Ed?
Well, I'm not sure which figures Councillor Ingham's referring to. There were allocations made in each of the towns in the local plan, which had numbers. I'm not sure if that's what he's referring to, but there weren't any figures for the villages specifically. That was an early iteration of the plan, which didn't follow through. It was left to villages to decide if they wanted to promote growth through their neighbourhood plans. So they didn't have specific numbers that they had to meet.
But if you had a neighbourhood plan, you created a number. Did you hit it or did you not bother? Thank you, Chair. I can argue with Mr. Freeman later about that, but it was a reality, and we'll
take that. We'll take that offline. If Mrs. Shaw, you could take us to an actual vote on the motion at hand.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, members, there are two elements to this motion. That Strategic Planning Committee note the various issues and options relating to the strategy for the distribution of development in the emerging local plan. And secondly, that Strategic Planning Committee note the intention for a further report refining the strategy for distribution of development to be presented at a future Strategic Planning Committee. Members, those of you in the chamber, please press your green tick if you're in support of the motion. Press your red cross if you're against the motion, or raise your electronic hand to indicate you're abstaining from the vote.
So for the benefit of those watching online, the vote is now taking place. And Chair, I can tell you that I have 9 votes for, no votes against, and no abstentions. So that is carried. Thank you, Chair.
Very much, Debbie, and thank you very much, Mrs. Shaw. I think at this time we'll take another short comfort break for members and officers. If we can be back for 25 to 4, just to do the last couple of items. Thank you. Debbie, I think we're all ready to start again. Just since the last break, Wendy, we've had Councillor Bailey and Councillor Pratt both give their apologies. They're no longer with us.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. So we'll move. Pardon? We don't need to. I've just said that we've lost another 2 members. But we'll move to agenda item 13, which is the emerging new local plan and the relationship with neighbouring plans. And Ed Freeman, it's over to you to present your report.
Thank you, Chairman. So yes, this report's looking at the relationship between the new local plan and neighbourhood plans, and how we can develop a local plan in partnership with our neighbourhood plans and work with the neighbourhood planning groups. So the report starts by just setting some context around neighbourhood planning and coverage of neighbourhood plans in East Devon. We now have over half of the parishes in the district who have embarked on neighbourhood planning processes, and we now have 21 made plans. Turnout at our neighbourhood plan referendums has generally been very high, certainly higher than the national average. And overall, we've got a good degree of community awareness and engagement in neighbourhood planning, which is great to see. In addition to all the made plans, there are at least a further 10 communities with plans actively being progressed, including 2 which have now been formally submitted for the final round of consultation and onto examination, and 3 that have recently completed that stage. So you've got in figure 1 a list of all the made and advanced plans in districts, and you'll see it provides a good level of coverage, including a number of the main towns, as well as various villages and rural parishes. So whilst all of our made and emerging neighbourhood plans are unique to their geographical area and communities, they also typically cover a similar range of themes and issues, including housing and employment, as we've covered a lot on this agenda, but also issues around the natural environment, landscape, the built environments and heritage and design issues, community services and facilities, transport access and connectivity, and increasingly they're covering issues around climate change and renewable energy, reflecting the wider community awareness of those issues. Protectionist in nature is probably a way of describing many of them. Many identify and protect specific valued community assets. A relatively small number are seeking to allocate significant development sites or growth, but there are some. Obviously, members will be aware of the implications for community infrastructure levy and the higher rate, 25%, that is received by the communities, the parishes, where there's a made neighbourhood plan as opposed to 15% otherwise. In terms of the national framework, the relationship between neighbourhood plans and local plans is quite clear. In general terms, neighbourhood plans are required to be in general conformity with the adopted local plan strategy and strategic policies, and are specifically required not to promote less development than is set out in the strategic policies for the area or undermine those strategic policies. As with the local plan, neighbourhood plans carry more weight as a material planning consideration the further they are progressed, and ultimately non-strategic policies in a made neighbourhood plan can have precedence over existing non-strategic policies where they're more up to date. But the precedence of the local plan is still there. So the new local plan, once adopted, will take precedence over any neighbourhood plan made prior to that. We've had lots of questions since the decision was made to progress a new local plan about the review process with neighbourhood planning groups. I think quite anxious about what was actually involved and the implications for them. So there's a section in the report about the review process that they can go through. Minor modifications can be made quite easily, but they are very minor and would only be a light touch approach. More material modifications do require further consultation and repeat of Regulation 14 and 16 consultations. However, there is government funding available through locality for that purpose. It's also worth noting that with emerging neighbourhood plans, they will be tested against conformity with the made local plan, the adopted local plan, but they will need to be mindful of the emerging local plan as well. And so we will reach a point where we will have to update our advice to neighbourhood planning groups about how they refer to the emerging neighbourhood plan within their work, so that we don't end up in a position where we've got a neighbourhood plan that's made the day before we adopt a new local plan and then it's immediately out of date, which would be the worst case scenario for everybody. So there's a clear approach in the adopted local plan to neighbourhood planning, which largely gives communities some free rein in terms of promoting growth and development, provided that that is sustainable or sets them on a path to promoting sustainable development objectives within their community. So members may wish to consider whether or not they're happy with that approach continuing, or other approaches might lead to specific numbers being attributed to communities in terms of housing growth that they should meet through their neighbourhood plans, which would be another option to consider. We've obviously had feedback through the issues and options consultation on these issues as well. So section 3 of the report seeks to summarise some of those issues. General feedback was around ensuring that we give neighbourhood plans sort of a basic level of consideration and acknowledgement of their role in determining the progress of the local plan, and fully endorsing them and feeding up messages from the neighbourhood plan process into the local plan process, rather than this being one-way traffic with us dictating downwards only. A number of practical suggestions have come out of that consultation, which are summarised in figure 2, around undertaking a thorough review of neighbourhood plans, including understanding their objectives, policies, designations, allocations. And we think this is a useful suggestion in terms of really a research project, really to understand overlap and issues that are covered in neighbourhood plans, to understand which issues are best addressed through that route and best addressed through the local plan route. Engagement with neighbourhood plan groups throughout the process, I think, is key, and more of that in a moment. Recognising, clearly define and utilise the role of neighbourhood plans in the local plan strategy and delivery of objectives, and engaging with neighbourhood planning groups through master planning of sites. So you recall a couple of committees ago we talked about design coding and developing design codes for sites allocated through the local plan, and we certainly see neighbourhood planning groups having a key role in terms of helping us to progress those where sites have been allocated. So we've tried to start the ball rolling in terms of engagement in neighbourhood planning groups, and we had a webinar discussion with a number of neighbourhood planning groups. We had a really good turnout of over 30 representatives from neighbourhood planning groups, and answered a whole raft of questions they had about the relationship and how this would work moving forward, issues around reviewing neighbourhood plans and what would be included within the local plan. And I think that sets a strong foundation for further engagement with neighbourhood planning groups as we progress with the local plan, and would hope to have further events like that in the future. So just turning to sort of key considerations and areas for discussion. Paragraph 4.4 in this report talks about role and remit. So interested to hear members' views on the role of neighbourhood plans in potentially informing local plan work. How do the two plans relate to each other in reality, in terms of do we seek to maintain the current approach whereby neighbourhood planning groups are free to allocate sites, and these are additional to planned numbers, or do we want to put the onus on neighbourhood plans as a means to allocate and bring forward our housing need in the district? Engagement, so we talked already about engagement with neighbourhood planning groups, but whether members think we should be doing more in that regard, and if so, how we go about doing that and implications for that in terms of the local plan production timetable. I know members are keen to progress production of the local plan as quickly as possible. Clearly, we need to engage with neighbourhood planning groups as well, and that can be quite time consuming as well. There's also a suggestion there whether it may be appropriate to have a member champion or a member with a role in terms of neighbourhood planning that might help to support them and advise them of those issues as we had in the past. Point C is around incorporation versus enabling. So this is to what extent the members wish to see made neighbourhood plans incorporated into the new local plan by saving some neighbourhood plan policies or including locally made designations such as local green spaces, or do we just set a policy framework that sets up communities to enable them to do that through their own neighbourhood plans and leave those things effectively devolving them down to the neighbourhood plans? How do we deal with conflicts? So maybe conflicts between neighbourhood plans. We may have existing neighbourhood plans that specifically seek to restrict growth in a particular area or particular settlement, and then through the local plan we are perhaps looking to promote growth in those areas, because looking holistically across the district, it makes sense and is a logical place to accommodate growth. So there's some questions there about how we deal with that, particularly where we've got a sort of protectionist neighbourhood plan in an area where it might be important for strategic growth to take place. The other issue we've raised at the bottom of page 166 is about the transition. So obviously we want to encourage neighbourhood planning groups to continue to progress their emerging neighbourhood plans, but increasingly mindful that obviously with our local plan work progressing, there's a danger that the work that they're doing could be referring to out-of-date policies and objectives in the adopted local plan in order to meet the legislative requirements of complying with our strategy, which is itself potentially evolving and changing. So we've given some thought to this, and we think it would be sensible for neighbourhood planning groups to be advised to try and avoid referring to policies in the existing adopted local plan wherever possible. There's no requirement for them to specifically refer to our policies, and by doing so there's a danger that their plan is immediately dated when that plan is then gone and replaced with a new local plan. So we think that's one simple measure they could be taking to try and minimise issues in terms of their plans becoming out of date, but we're mindful that we'll also need to advise them as things emerge to ensure that they're having suitable regard to the emerging local plan as well. And it may be that we reach a point where the best advice we can give them is perhaps to press pause until a new local plan strategy is determined and progressing through examination or indeed adopted, for fear that they could be putting a lot of work into something that potentially doesn't comply with an emerging local plan. So there's quite a few meaty issues there for members to give some thought to, and would appreciate members' thoughts on those issues. There's a number of specific recommendations, recommendations at the start of the report, specifically seeking members to discuss the points I've raised in section 4 in recommendation 2, but specifically asking members at recommendation 3 to endorse the undertaking of the detailed analysis of existing neighbourhood plans that I referred to, which I think could be a useful piece of work to do. And also in terms of recommendation 4 around endorsing the development of a communications plan to document how we liaise with neighbourhood planning communities throughout the local plan process and bring that to a future meeting, because I think protecting those relationships and ensuring that those are productive and that there's a two-way conversation going on with neighbourhood planning groups and communities throughout the local plan preparation process is going to be really important to ensuring that we've got all the information we need to come up with a sound local plan, but also that they have an understanding as to where we're going and how that might impact on their work as well. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Freeman. Does any member wish to speak on this? Councillor Hayward.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I'm very supportive, and I thank Mr. Freeman for his work and the comprehensive nature of this. As members know, I'm the clerk to 2 parishes that have neighbourhood plans. One made quite a while ago, the Chardstock Plan, which I should know off the top of my head, but was in 2017. and the Newton Popperford and Hertford neighbourhood plan, which was very recent. The referendum was in May of this year. So I'm heartened by this. I'm also on the steering group for Axminster's neighbourhood plan, and we discussed this very issue only last week. And I think the communication and the support of the district council for those parishes and the few towns that don't have one is going to be critical. You know, the money is almost a moot point. We know there's always money available for it, but it's the support of people like Angela to help the towns and the parishes deliver these neighbourhood plans, because they are hugely time intensive and they're very labour intensive. And the last thing you want to do is discourage towns and parishes from going forward with it on the basis that, well, you know, the new local plan might completely rip up all that work you've done. I think those parishes and towns that have already gone through it, they understand that, they knew that at the outset, and so they're now revisiting some of them may not be. But I think as long as we can offer them support and guidance and take on board the plans that have been made in our ruminations about the local plan, but also bear in mind that it's just, we've got to communicate, we've got to talk to them and let them know that it's not a futile exercise. Don't stop what you're doing now, but as Ed says, perhaps just adapt what you're doing so that you're not making direct correlation with our existing plan, but you're sort of setting the groundwork for a future local plan. And as long as we can show goodwill and intent in doing that, there's no reason to stop the process that we're doing. Yeah, that's about it really. I mean, in terms of the 4 recommendations, I have personally no problem with those. I'll be happy to propose them. In terms of the discussion points, I suppose that the key one is the issue of D, conflicts. You know, it's our duty to resolve conflicts because some of the parishes, and I know one in particular, have they're slightly disenchanted with the neighbourhood plan process because they believe they put forward a neighbourhood plan, and yet on I think at least 3 occasions the plan has, despite objections being put forward to planning applications citing the neighbourhood plan, the application has gone through because they didn't carry enough weight. And they don't feel that they're protectionist, they just felt they want to protect their parish against inappropriate development. But it's all about context and its interpretation. But they all understood from the outset that the local plan is the primary legislation and that their neighbourhood plan had to accord to that. I do feel slightly sorry for the 3 towns closest to me, so Axminster, Honiton and Seaton, which haven't gone down that road yet. Chair, I know you're the mayor of Seaton, and that Honiton is having some change at the moment. Axminster went as far as it could, it then sort of fell by the wayside, but the new membership of that council is taking it forward again. So that's heartening that they haven't just given up all hope. But I think this transition period is very important. So as long as we as a primary authority using the legislation we have can support them, both in officer time, financially, I think it's very positive to carry forwards. But as we've discussed several times during this meeting, you know, at any time central government could decide to ride roughshod over these things. So, but that's the same with all planning. So we just got to crack on, do the best we can, and show support to our towns and parishes. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much for that, Councillor Hayward. Councillor Skinner, you're up next.
I shan't add too much more because I think Councillor Hayward's covered that very well, and I'm going to second the recommendation if indeed Councillor Hayward has put that forward. I think there's a much bigger role, and one of the things Councillor Hayward did touch on was the fact that lots of these parish councils now are seeing the neighbourhood plans as part of the planning process, and in fact feeling that they're going to have some sort of say in the outcome of that. That's not actually what the role is about. The neighbourhood plan is a much bigger process than that, and it's about understanding the village. And I would like to see it more working in the way of understanding what housing they've got, and then understanding the people within that particular village the age concept of those people, understanding the type of houses. And let me just give you an example. I'll just take Tallaghton as an example. We've got a little small block in Tallaghton of what would be bungalows, which was predominantly for some people within the village. So as they got older, they came out of the houses, and this is a progression that you get. You start with a small house, and you have a bigger one, then you have a bit bigger one, and you have the kids, and the kids all come along. You get your bigger house because they're the kids, and then the kids fly the nest. They get to get married, and then you want to downsize a little bit. And of course, it also comes those people who very much rural areas were a farming background and rented accommodation within farms and the like. And then, of course, they move out of that. They become not quite so well and one thing and another, and they want to be a bit closer into the centre of the village. And what the East Devon District Council did many, many years ago in having those council bungalows were very, very good. Now, of course, what comes with the right to buy is you get that with the right to buy, and then you get somebody who wants to buy the right to buy, then they want to sort of put an extension onto the house, put it upstairs, do this, and it changes the dynamics of the village. And what's really important, and I shall never forget, and I'll just try and be as brief as I can, I'm sure we want to get on. I will never forget in Orliscombe when I was councillor there, I very much supported a young family, that the young family was growing and they wanted to put an extension on the house. And I really got behind them and put an extension on the house. Unfortunately, that no sooner had they got the extension onto the house, they actually sold the house with the uplift with the extension and moved. And I felt as a councillor duped in a way. I felt a bit like, well, I helped you to increase the value of your house. You turned that in, and you. In some ways, I'm conflicted because in one sense you can't blame them, but in another sense, I felt that overwhelming sort of. And do you know what really drilled down to me for that, in that knowledge and that experience with that, which has stayed with me ever since it's happened, is that they're almost from a neighbourhood plan process. There also almost needs to be a designation of all of the houses that you've got with the population of people that you've got. And this is systemic even in the towns. And Councillor Ragg was speaking about it earlier, talking about particular retirement home people, that it's actually becoming the centre for McCarthy and Stone. And in what way do you change the dynamics of a particular town in the way of encouraging a certain age group to come that actually then have a mindset of a certain way that then is systemic in stopping in that town, or what in this case could be village, in moving on. So for me, the neighbourhood plan, as important as what it is, I've never actually seen, and I'm sure I don't want Mr. Freeman would see what he has to say, but I very much would like to see the neighbourhood plan talking about employment, what's within this village. And it's surprising what employment in a little village like Tallaghton, the little bits that we have got. If you took the pub, the shop, the farms, the village shop, I do manufacturing at my little farm, and it's all part, and I employ 9 people, and actually how many other people are around that actually, so what is the knowledge? And then when you get all of that knowledge, you can understand when you're just going to start to talk about growth, whom are you now aiming the growth at? Because it's that whom are you aiming the growth at that should encourage a village to say where they want that growth to be and how they want to do that. And it's not just merely, let's do a neighbourhood plan because we want to stop development happening over here and it's part of that process. It's a much bigger process. And in actual fact, if you can understand it from that level, that's exactly what we do at this level. It's the same thing. It's just understanding whom are we developing for? Where do we want to be? What's our DNA? What culture are we trying to follow behind? So for me, I'm very much in support of. I'm very much supportive of all the things that Councillor Hayward said. The one conflict I do have, and I do have a conflict, is there are many villages that want to use it as they want to be a part of the planning process. That's fine, but I'm sure Mr. Freeman would know in the many years of experience I've had with parish councils, is the parish councils, the level of parish councils and parish councillors varies dramatically, from some being really, really good to some, the volunteers not really doing that much. And I'm not trying to be critical. I'm just saying where those levels are and where they want to be. So I see the neighbourhood plan process as being a part of a parish taking on the neighbourhood plan in understanding what have they got, what is the structure of that, where do they want to be, and what do they want to do. And then the planning process feeds into that. Not a particular application comes up, and they wanted to stop that one, and then they want to use the neighbourhood plan to stop that one, and then it don't work that way round. That's not what for me, that's not what neighbourhood plans are. It's a process of understanding, and that's why it's really difficult work. Because when you've got to drill down to do all this, the amount of work required to do this, and I do agree again with Councillor Hayward, is the understanding, and perhaps he knows as being a clerk with some parishes, that the amount of work required to do this from volunteers is quite massive, and they need a lot of help into doing that and how that process comes forward. And I think then we would get perhaps 1 or 2 more parish councils. I could take Tallaght as an example, hasn't got one, and Alderscombe, because they find the magnitude of the work from volunteers who are already relatively busy people really quite difficult. And on that basis, we struggle with it. But I'm very supportive. I will be seconding Councillor Hayward's recommendation of going with this application, this motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Skinner. Councillor Ingham.
Thank you, Chair. I agree with what Councillors Hayward and Skinner have said. We've been asked on the second item, how do we see this? The second recommendation. And, what is that balance, between the local plan and neighbourhood plan? Thank goodness for the Localism Act. I'm not a big fan of the Prime Minister that brought that in, to say the least. But it was an admission that national government were failing, and they were going to carry on failing. And to some degree, this really has helped some districts, some counties, some authorities to encourage the participation of village communities in the whole thing. And that's a great thing. If that horrible Prime Minister achieved one success, and there weren't many, I think this was one. So I think the message that I would want Mr. Freeman to take away with this is that the word together. For us to lead this, we have to work with the parish councils in order to help guide, support them, so we carry on this process of improvement, of addressing the needs and aspirations of our communities. Then after a number of years, we might actually get it right, Chair. And I think that's the aim of all of us here as district councillors. So that's the word I've got for Mr. Freeman, is together. That's how we address those items. We work with the parish councils to make our local plan and their neighbourhood plans successful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Ingham. Councillor Rylance.
Thank you, Chair. Just one contradiction to contradict Councillor Ingham. The Localism Act was a Lib Dem policy enacting coalition. I don't think David Cameron could be held responsible for it. I think it's a very good thing, and I think the Conservatives have tried to roll back on it ever since. So yes, neighbourhood plan. When this meeting finally ends, I'm going off to my neighbourhood plan overview meeting for Broadclist. It is an incredibly grueling process putting together a neighbourhood plan, particularly one that's quite complicated and that actually has some ambitions for the community. And in Broadclist, the reason we've only just got to Reg 14 is because it's been going for many years as we've tried to evolve our plan in accordance with the local plan and the national planning framework and all the other strictures and restrictions on it. We're nearly there, I'm pleased to say. What does actually help is having a good dialogue with the planning authority. And I think some villages out in the countryside probably feel quite detached from what the planning authority does. And I think that's a problem. So the more we can communicate with them and the more we can dialogue with them, the better. And I've seen even in my own ward, or my ward and its original boundaries, how assailed some villages felt by what East Devon Council does. And in that kind of context, you're not going to get the best out of a village. It's not going to be able to put together a neighbourhood plan that actually meets the aspirations of the future. they tend to end in be in battle mode really, and sort of retrench, pull back behind their battle lines. And I think for some villages, bringing in a neighbourhood plan that's fairly simple and says we don't want any more development is actually out of fear. And I just feel that's a symptom of not communicating enough with every community. And yeah, it's true that there are varying levels of ability within our communities in terms of how well they interact with other parts of the governance. But I feel like maybe we need to help some of those communities to achieve their best. What would be really galling, having got to Reg 14 with the Broadclose neighbourhood plan, is if somebody turned around and said, oh, well, actually, you contradict the emerging local plan. So everything you've done for the last 6 years is completely rubbish and has to be thrown out of the window. And I sincerely hope that that is not the kind of relationship we would end up having with villages. So I was a little alarmed to hear that you might be telling people to park their neighbourhood plan for a bit, because that's how you lose volunteers. That's how you lose motivation within teams, and that's how you lose momentum on a plan. So it is complicated. I know it's complicated. I know it's messy. And I know things change, and things over the last 6 years of our neighbourhood plan have changed a lot. But it's the best thing we've got at the moment to get community buy-in. And so, obviously I'm a big fan of neighbourhood plans, as you can probably tell. But I do feel that the more interaction we can have with every single community, the better. And the more villages get on board with, helping to decide their own future, the better. So it's possibly a question of playing the long game really for some villages, because they don't really realise what they can do yet. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rylance. I think me and Ed have spoken about this quite a few times at our fortnightly meetings, and discussing from my personal opinion, that we need early engagement with these neighbourhood plan groups, and we need to keep that dialogue up throughout the whole of the process. So they are some of the first people to know about any changes that we're making to what would be different to our existing local plan. I think it is just about keeping those lines of communication throughout the whole process. And that's the easiest way to gain hearts and minds throughout this process. To try and make it as easy as possible for all stakeholders and all groups. Ed, do you have anything you wish to add before we go to the vote?
No, I don't think so. As you say, I think we can develop this communication plan that can perhaps look at some of these scenarios as well, and that are discussed at paragraph 4.4, and how we might deal with them to take this discussion forward. But I would certainly agree that we need to work together with the neighbourhood planning groups.
Thank you very much. So, Mrs. Shaw, can you take us to a vote, please?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, members, there's 4 elements to this motion. That committee note the role and coverage and state of play of neighbourhood planning in the district and the relationship with the local plan adopted and emerging. That committee consider and comment on the discussion points set out in section 4 of the report. That thirdly, that committee endorse the undertaking of a detailed analysis of the existing neighbourhood plans to inform the preparation of the local plan, the findings of which will be reported back at a future meeting. And lastly, that committee endorse the development of a communications plan for liaison with neighbourhood planning communities throughout the local plan production, and that to be brought back to a future meeting for member approval. Members, those of you in the chamber, please press your green tick if you're in support of those motion, press your red cross if you're against the motion, or raise your electronic hand to indicate you're abstaining from the vote.
And Chair, I have 6 votes for, no votes against, and no abstentions. So that is carried. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. So the last agenda item for today is agenda item 14, which is the duty to cooperate. Yeah, I don't vote. Oh, you don't vote? Yeah. I never vote. So the last agenda item of today is agenda item 14, which is the duty to cooperate, and it's over to Ed Freeman for the last.
Thank you, Chair. So we touched on the duty to cooperate a couple of times today. As members will be aware, it's a legal requirement to work with certain bodies in respect of strategic cross-boundary issues that could have a significant impact on at least 2 local planning authority areas. If we don't prepare the local plan in accordance with the duty, then there is a real danger that it will not be examined and cannot be found sound and adopted. So it is a key legislative requirement as things stand, acknowledging that the planning white paper talked about withdrawing this duty. But until it is withdrawn, we have to adhere to it. So we've identified a number of strategic matters where we think it's likely that we'll need to work with others as we prepare the local plan. And we've grouped these into 8 topics around transport, water quality, climate change, habitat mitigation, nature recovery and net gain, and landscape and green infrastructure. And basically what the report seeks to do is just to alert members to the list of bodies that we think we need to cooperate with, which are listed at 2.1. We quite commonly talk about our neighbouring district councils and authorities, but so it also takes in Environment Agency, Historic England, Homes England, Natural England, Highways England, right the way down to the Marine Management Organisation, NHS and CCG. So there's quite a broad range of bodies that we think we need to engage with through this process. And then table 3 highlights the key topics. So there's the key topic heading that I've already referred to on the left-hand side of the table, the partners that we think we'll need to engage with on those issues, and then some of the evidence we think we'll need to gather to address those issues and potentially do that jointly with those authorities. So for example, we refer to Egyptian traveller studies that have been done in the past across a wider area, and it may well be appropriate to do that work in partnership again. In fact, I think that's where that's heading in terms of doing that across the Greater Exeter area, for example. And then there's some notes alongside that. So you'll see we've noted that Torbay have asked for help meeting their strategic housing need under the housing section, as was referred to earlier. And there's notes around Dorset Council in relation to stability and drainage issues that have been highlighted there as well. So I won't go through the whole table, but there's a list of all of the various agencies and how we seek to engage with them and the issues we think we need to engage on. So the recommendations are that Strategic Planning Committee agree that the initial work on cross-boundary strategic issues be focused around the topics listed in Table 3 in the report, and that Strategic Planning Committee note the requirement to maintain and publish a statement of common ground, which I didn't refer to, but the tail end of the report refers to that, and that's an important part of progressing through this process, is that we document that process and that we can advise the inspector when it comes to the examination through statements of common ground, areas where we've reached agreement with those duty to cooperate bodies, and so narrow down the issues for debate through the examination where agreement hasn't been possible to reach, albeit hopefully we'll be able to reach agreement on all key issues with all the key bodies. So that's the recommendations and the key parts of that report. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ed. So first up, can I call Councillor Paul Hayward, please?
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, cooperation is a two-way street, and I certainly wouldn't want to put Mr. Freeman on the spot, and I'll understand if he does plead the Fifth Amendment. But I just, for the purpose of the duty to cooperate that we exercise, just to ask Mr. Freeman, in your experience, since you've been with this authority, do all of those bodies embrace the duty to cooperate? Are they all, is there reciprocation? Or, and again, I certainly wouldn't expect you to name or identify any particular one. That would be unfair to you and unfair to them. But do you think that they embrace what we need to do in the spirit of what's intended? Or do you just think some perhaps just, you know, what you get back from them, you know, is a sort of cut and paste, yes, 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 whatever sort of thing? Do they understand why we must do it? Not just because it's required by law, because we genuinely want to know what they want to say? Just your thoughts, really.
Thank you, Chair. I don't want to appear pedantic, but I'm afraid I'm going to be on table 3. I absolutely support the recommendations, Chair, quite happy to propose them. But I think we should be putting in that table climate change right at the front of it, just to remind us that from now on, everything else takes second place. And the most important thing that we have to address in the next few years is climate change in everything we do, including any local plan or strategic planning that we conduct in our time as councillors. Thank you, Chair. If in future we can escalate that as the most important topic. Thank you.
I'm sure that can be done for subsequent reports. Councillor Skinner, you're up next.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me okay? Am I working? Okay. Yes, I'm going to be, if Councillor Ingham is making the recommendation, I'm going to be supporting that recommendation. I do actually concur with his views of climate change as well, and making sure we have a push that forward. I'm very much keen on page 181 on leisure proposals for sporting venues serving wider area than an East Devon need, with Mid Devon State Somerset Devon County. Very much a big pro advocator of that. And I think I'm going to leave it to that, Chair. Leaving it short for me. Sorry about that. We'll go with that. Thank you.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. Councillor Kevin Blakey, final speaker of the day.
Thank you, Chair. I did actually lower my hand for the reason that I was going to say that the proposal came from Councillor Ingham. I was going to second it, but Councillor Skinner got in first, and I think it's quite simple, quite obvious. So let's.
Thank you very much. As I said it, Councillor Ryan stuck up a hand up right at the end.
Hi, I just wanted to say how very refreshing it is to hear my colleagues so very much to my right over there endorsing tackling climate change. Makes a very nice change. Thank you.
It's not a change at all. It's sustained.
I might add,
we'll leave that
through you. I might add very quickly.
Councillors, it's not needed. It's not needed. We've had a really, we've had a nice day. Let's leave it like that.
So let's not do the comments then that precluded it earlier. Leave them out. Otherwise, I will retaliate.
So we've had a proposal and a seconder. Can we take that to a vote, please, Mrs. Shaw?
Thank you, Chair. We have two elements to this motion, members. That Strategic Planning Committee agree that the initial work on cross-boundary strategic issues be focused around the topics set out in Table 3 of this report, and that Strategic Planning Committee note the requirement to maintain and publish a statement or statements of common ground. Members, those of you in the chamber, please press your green tick if you're in support of the motion, press your red cross if you're against the motion, or raise your electronic hand to indicate you're abstaining from the vote.
And Chair, I can confirm you have 6 votes for, no votes against, and no abstentions. So that is carried. Thank you, Chair. Chair, I think you're muted.
Apologies for that. So that brings our meeting to an end. I would like to thank everyone, including any members of the public watching online, for taking part. Can I remind all those present that your comments will be live to the public until the meeting is confirmed that we are no longer live. Thank you to all the officers for spending so much time today. It's been an absolute marathon meeting.
Thank you all.